Hi, I'm Marcus Coward, and this is Wake Up New Bedford, and I'm here with Andrew O'Leary. Andrew, thanks for being here.
My pleasure.
So this is part 2, where we're going to talk a little bit more about the position he's in now with being Superintendent of Public Schools here in New Bedford, and talk about some of the challenges and some of the things he's learned along the way, along with what he has in store for the future. So we left off in part 1, where you were teaching at BCC, at the same time being a grant writer. But at what point do you transfer into being superintendent? How does that transition happen for you?
Yeah, I started moving into senior leadership position in the business and finance, and then that's a lot. You need to be all in. You need to be 100% committed to that. It is something of a 24/7 job, late meetings, working on reports through the night, deadlines to meet, and all of that. You do truly have to be all in.
Okay.
And so with teaching and learning, you have to commit to students. Okay, so you can't compromise either one of those. So I did. It was pretty much like 10, maybe 11 full years of teaching history, and so I put that to one side. But maybe I can get back, as I was joking with you at the previous time we spoke. Maybe I can get back to that at some point.
Yeah.
But yeah, I just had to be all in. So about 5 years ago, or maybe longer, I went all in on the district leadership piece.
Okay. And so by all in, did you have to quit your job in order to campaign? Do you have to campaign?
No, it wasn't so
like?
much campaign, but the opportunity comes up. And again, if you think about it, so New Bedford Public Schools, 13,000 kids. At the time, it was about $150 million budget. And challenges, reductions in funding. We're always trying to balance a budget. We're trying to deal with layoffs. We're trying to deal with unanticipated demands. There was a budget crisis around 2012. It's a big deal. You can't be distracted. You have to be all in. So they post a position and they say, who wants this job?
Sure.
And you could translate to say, who wants this stress? Who wants this career risk? Who wants to go out on a limb? Who wants this responsibility? And so I said, okay, I'll give it a shot.
Sure.
So, yeah, and so that was a big transition for me, the first big leadership job. And then I was older than I was when I started in the district, so now there's a whole new kind of imposter syndrome. Oh, wow, can I really do this? Or, wow, and you're still learning on the job because there's nuances to it. I'm still looking up to people who are in that role and trying to learn from them. And so, but it was a big transition for me as well, and I did have to leave the teaching behind, or press pause.
So you say this was the first big leadership position, but you were the director of the grant writing, essentially.
Yeah.
And so did you not feel like that kind of prepared you for this?
It certainly did, but maybe not completely.
Sure.
Because this is where the joke comes in that I talked about in the first episode about not understanding finance and accounting.
Sure.
You truly do have to understand it. You have to understand everything. And so I am learning on the job. Now I'm learning about construction, because we have construction projects. I'm learning about finance, the state budget process in even more detail, and funding formulas in even more detail. And then I'm actually learning of what the impact is. So we had tough budget times. And it is so tragic to have to cut an arts program. It's so tragic to have to lay off staff. It's so tragic to look at another district that's very well funded and to look at some of the gaps here, to have leaks in a roof. All of that, I had talked previously about my passion for New Bedford, and to see all those compromises really kind of burned me and gave me a healthy chip on my shoulder as well about, well, maybe we can do better.
Sure. And so first, when talking about the budget, you said it was $120, $150 million. Has it gone up since then?
Yeah, so right now, so that was about 13 years ago, and right now it's about $250 million.
Wow.
That's the local budget, and then when you do big projects, you could have a $30 million school project, and then if a big federal grant comes in, the COVID money came in, that was up to $75 million. So ultimately, I would say you have a $300 million operation. So it is a big deal, and if in the top leadership positions, you want somebody who's fully committed and has nothing else distracting them from that. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Absolutely, absolutely. And so, do you feel like a lot of that has to do with us actually raising the amount of money that we have, or does a lot of that have to do with inflation as well?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's been reform. So Massachusetts was not investing sufficiently in its schools. And Massachusetts likes to be number one. Massachusetts has a lot of wealth. But there was kind of a hidden history there where Fall River, New Bedford, and other cities were getting left behind.
Okay.
And every child in Massachusetts, every student in Massachusetts has innate potential. And in my own personal story, and I'm sure in everyone else's personal story, you can see how investing in children and giving them opportunity leads to wonderful things. And that's the future. You don't even have to be romantic about that. You can be practical about that.
Sure.
You know, investing in children is good for every aspect of society and the economy. So if we think about that, then underinvesting is a real tragedy.
Sure.
And we were able to do some work. It was called the Foundation Budget Review Commission to say the state is underinvesting in New Bedford Fall River. If we have students on IEPs, if we have English learner students who are going to really enrich and migrant students who are going to really enrich the city and enrich the state, just like the immigration story always has done, then surely we need to invest more. All studies show we need to invest more. So we went to the legislature and said, well, hey, you need to invest more, and that was what was called the Student Opportunity Act. And you can really start to see the benefits of that when you go into classrooms, and I go into classrooms. You can really see a difference from when I first started in the district 20 years ago.
And so would you say that the biggest challenge or goal that you set out when you first took this position was to raise the budget in order to start investing more?
No, I think the biggest goal was to demonstrate the potential, to amplify what was so great about New Bedford. I've become a hometown guy, right? I just really want to talk about what I truly, honestly perceive New Bedford as a special place. I truly, honestly believe that our teachers and our students have a special contribution to make, and want to talk about that. And you have to talk about that first. Okay, how do we do that? Well, it just so happens, and we can prove it in terms of policy, in terms of history, in terms of the funding formula, that the state can and should do more, and we were able to demonstrate that. But I've got a deal for the state. If you invest more, the students and staff in New Bedford will pay you back with progress, with success, with excellence as well. And that all sounds wonderful, but that's every day. That's every year, and you've got to navigate things like the federal chaos that we're seeing right now, and you need multiple other people to do that. You need great teachers, great leaders, and we have them. So it's the whole package together, but you've got to keep bringing it back to classrooms, you've got to keep bringing it back to kids, and you've got to keep talking about what's great about New Bedford.
So please let me know if this question is a little bit out of your purview, but with the attack that the Department of Education is under, if it was gone, how would that affect the school system here in New Bedford?
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack there because the funding, first of all, 10% of our funding comes from the federal government.
Okay.
So that's 10%, it's not a majority, and so in theory, as that gets reduced, we could navigate and we could pivot and we could bob and weave a little bit. So we never want to talk about, I'm very reluctant to talk about crisis. Sometimes people in public sphere, I don't know if you're in health or you're in education, some of the best ways to get what you want is to talk about crisis. Sure. And say there's a crisis, so give us more funding. There's a crisis, give us more sympathy and support.
You make it sound more urgent.
Make it sound more urgent. I don't like crisis framing. I really like potential framing and investment framing.
Sure.
So that said, it's very concerning.
Yeah.
What's going on in Washington. It's chaotic and it's irresponsible. It's irresponsible what's going on, and it should be called out and it should be pushed back against, because we have a great obligation and great opportunity here. So if the Department of Education went away, that's an umbrella. Some of the functions are still there.
Sure.
That said, does that mean that they're going to try and erode those functions? The Department of Education has a job to protect civil rights. We are a big organization. Any big organization is going to make mistakes. Any big organization is going to have biases. Any big organization, most big organizations in this country or around the world, have a legacy of bias, have a legacy of not serving marginalized populations. Department of Education was all about that up to January 2025. We would work with them on civil rights reports, on data, to show equitable outcomes, all of that. Now, nobody likes that. Nobody would like an IRS audit, but if you sit back, you say, well, IRS audits are a good idea, right? Or revealing fraud, revealing mistakes is a good idea.
Absolutely.
So what we're starting to realize now is nobody liked the Department of Education saying, hey, we want to review your civil rights and equitable outcomes. But I think we can all agree, no, reviewing civil rights and equitable outcomes is a good thing. So if that goes away, that's huge. If the funding is not valued, it mightn't go away immediately, but you can start to see the wins and the trends, and maybe one or two of these programs go away. So it's very concerning, and I think we need to look at the value of what the Department of Education brings and had brought, and we need to look past the crisis narrative to say what's truly going on.
Great answer. So, talking about teachers, in recent history, honestly, in America, there's just been a national teacher shortage for several different reasons. Did you see New Bedford impacted in that aspect, and have we rebounded from that, or are we still kind of going through it?
Yeah, I think we always have room for more teachers. I think our hiring is less than 100%, okay, so there's room there. You're always concerned. I think looking at our data, we have a lot of teachers in the first 5 years, and a lot of teachers who may be in the last 5 or 10 years. It's almost like a U-shape looking at our data. So that somewhat concerns you as well, because excellent educators who've worked hard for 30, 35 years could be leaving our district. And so we want to ensure we're supporting new educators. They talk about that mark, the 5-year mark. First 5 weeks is tough. The first year is tough. And so if you can bear that out, you're learning the whole time. I know this from my own experience. And then the 5-year mark, you're in. You're going to stay a teacher.
Sure.
And then, you know, if you started teaching at age 20, you know, you're going to be settling down, starting a family. Is the teaching profession going to work for you? This is not just about money or dollars and cents, or this is about, you know, you want to build a true workforce, and these things matter. Quality of life matters. Things like parental leave matters. All of that is important. Things like community, living in your city and living in your region and believing in your city, and growing up and seeing your kids at the supermarket or the ball field, is all that's important. So much of that weighs into our thinking when we're trying to like develop a contract and work with the teachers union. So to your main question though, we hadn't seen the crisis. But you don't want to wait, you want to forecast, and you want to say, wait a second, is something going on with the teaching profession? Are people going into teaching? Are high school kids saying teaching is a good career? Are student loans going to discourage people from taking out a student loan to get qualified for teaching position and then have to pay that back? Does the salary match up? We think about this stuff constantly. Fortunately though, overall our numbers are pretty stable right now, and I'm very encouraged with the amount of new teachers we're seeing.
Okay, amazing.
But I'm not sure that can last. That can change on a dime every year. Are there signals out there? There's a lot of negativity about schools and education, and that's what's behind this U.S. Department of Education move.
Do you think maybe the biggest ask of teachers, maybe in this area or in general, has to do with salaries?
Yeah, salary is important. Salary is really important. I think what happened was around 2000, in the 2000s, there was an attempt to create new models, charter schools, other school choice models, and I think actually if you look at the data, they heavily relied on folks early in their career. So if I'm paying a majority of teachers $80,000, $90,000, and I'm getting $15,000 per student, a charter school is paying $50,000 per student, or I'm sorry, $50,000 salary, and getting $15,000 per student, and paying less health care. I mean, this is where it really gets into details.
Sure.
Then they have, for a few years, they have a $5–10 million advantage. They can put more into the facility. They can put more into advertising and other initiatives, and all of a sudden it looks like, oh wow, those stodgy old traditional school districts are really not cutting it, and look at this new innovative district. So you're actually seeing, to get into like an analysis, you're seeing this maturing of charter schools where they're having to pay more to keep staff, or realizing the value of keeping staff. I'm a big believer in keeping staff. I mean, again, going back about 10, 15 years ago, there was this idea that you could be like an NFL football coach and fire your way to success, and if you can't cut it, you're out. If you can't cut it, you're out. That's absurd. It doesn't work in education. We want educators here for the long haul.
Sure.
That's a value we have.
Absolutely. And just being at the last school committee meeting where there was, you know, the NBEA, you know, showed out in numbers, that it was great to see the school committee and them come to an agreement and really put the teachers first, and make sure that we're doing all that we can in order to keep them and raise that retention. For sure.
Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic. You know, in Massachusetts, you know, we can talk about it. There's a lot of controversy around teachers' unions and strikes and the Mass Teachers Association. And so in theory, I'm superintendent. And so in theory, I'm antagonistic with the union, right? We go back and forth like that. But that doesn't work. We perceive ourselves as educators. Those of us who are administrators, the gray bureaucrats, we still perceive ourselves as educators. We know that the only value we generate is truly in the classroom.
Yeah.
An effective classroom has an effective teacher who is satisfied with everything that the district is providing for them, and that's not always the case. It's a hard job. Budget times can be hard, so keeping our staff feeling validated is so important. And so a healthy relationship with the teachers union is very important. But you'll see there was teacher strikes around Massachusetts. Union bargaining is never easy because the district wants to ensure that there's money there for the next 5 or 10 years. You never want that budget deficit. And then the teachers union are saying, well, hey, maybe in the other town I could leave and get $5,000 more, or the health insurance plan is better over there. So you have to strike that balance, and you have to get it right.
Yeah. And so you brought up IEPs, and when I was, you know, in school, you know, middle school, elementary school, I had never heard of that term. It was only up until recently, the last couple of years, where I've even heard that existed. Was that a thing 15 years ago, and I just didn't know about it, or was that a more recent concept?
Yeah, it's always been a thing in terms of the medium-length history of education in Massachusetts and the United States.
Sure.
But this is something I like to talk about
Sure.
because we were talking about earlier that people like to beat up on schools and education. And I don't know if you've heard it, but we hear it a lot, is American schools are failing and American education is failing. I don't buy that for a second. Because when you actually unpack it, that's not the case. American schools are fantastic. And one of the places they lead the world is in special education.
Okay.
And one of the places that it emerged from the civil rights movement, et cetera, in 1974, they passed the Individual with Disabilities in Education Act, IDEA. IDEA, so it's coming up on the 50th anniversary of IDEA. And what that meant is people who have disabilities have rights. They have rights to the most inclusive setting. They have rights to the most free and appropriate public education. And that sounds intuitive to us, well, of course, but that wasn't always the case. You did have folks who had moderate to severe disabilities who school systems or cities or states or even the country said, no, we don't have to meet we don't have to go above and beyond for you. We don't have to do anything extra for you. You either sink or you swim. And you still have countries around the world that still have that approach. I'm from Ireland, as you know. Some of my colleagues who I went to school with, they launched a huge campaign in Ireland. It was a sleep out. They were sleeping out on the steps of the legislature in Ireland because their children couldn't get inclusive placements.
Sure.
We would do that in a month. You would have an IEP, you would have a placement in a month over here. It's difficult, it's challenging, you don't get it right all the time, it's very expensive, but we make that commitment as a right. And so you have, I talked about Ireland as this wealthy country. You have a wealthy country that doesn't have that set up. So it's unfashionable to talk about how great American schools are because there's just been this notion that, or panic or anxiety that we're falling behind. But really, if you think about it, it's not the case. And we should definitely laud IDEA. It's the 50th anniversary, and I like to say IDEA is America's best idea.
That's catchy.
It's catchy, yeah. And we're going to be promoting it this year, too.
Okay. And then, so something that kind of goes hand in hand with accessibility is ELL, or English Language Learning Students. And so, are we doing everything we can in order to support them, and what does that look like? So
education, like we were talking about, is the unlocking of potential, right? And so inherently, an immigrant student and an immigrant family are entrepreneurial. They got up and moved somewhere, right? So there's an energy there. And that's always been the case. There's wonderful stories, most people's families have that background as well, of folks who up and moved to another place. Migration across states, moves for opportunity, migration across the nation, and migration internationally as well. And so it's inherent that migrant, immigrant students, immigrant families have that potential. So how do you unlock it? And one of the ways you unlock it is English learner strategies. And those have evolved from like straight immersion, okay, you can sink or swim, to actually validating through what we call culturally and linguistically sustaining practices. That's a term we use a lot. What does that mean? So you're more likely to learn if the literature I provide to you validates your culture.
Sure.
If your linguistic practices, we've learned so much about cognitive science in the past 20 years about language acquisition, that cognitively, the native language you have has grammatically and linguistically arranged things somewhat differently, so not bypassing that or not forcing you outside of that can actually help develop your early literacy. So then those culturally and linguistically sustaining practices unlock the potential for a student, a multilingual student, to learn English.
Absolutely.
And unlocks the potential for them to succeed in school, and then they have that cycle of validation. And so we have what's called a student growth percentile. How much did this student, student A, grow versus peers around the state? We have so much data, we can say, well, here's a student that's similar to student A. And how much, using culturally and linguistically sustaining practice, does student A grow versus their peers?
Sure.
And so we have a percentile for that. And so what you'll see with English learner students in New Bedford, with the appropriate strategies, they grow at the 60th or 70th percentile versus their peers. They're growing faster.
Sure.
That's so exciting. It's working. And so we have model programs for that, and it's so exciting, and the city and the state is going to benefit by that.
And was that something that you tried to champion and that came like with you being superintendent, or was that already in place and working before you?
No,
got
we
there?
have great teams and advocates who've done that for about 10 years, and then,
Sure.
and it was difficult at first because those students were somewhat invisible. They weren't being appropriately recognized, they weren't being appropriately assessed to see what their needs were, and other things, families, et cetera, may not have been included. So we have great teams of folks in our English language department as well, and our Equitable Pathways department, and we have great teams of educators who jumped on this reform, because Massachusetts itself had to reform its sheltered English immersion strategies as well. And so it's districts that do have a large number of English learners led the way in that. New Bedford led the way. Certainly wasn't my work. It was the work of my predecessors and the work of people who are still in the district today, and especially the work of teachers who know how to develop and implement these strategies.
Okay. Very humble and honest answer, as were all your answers today. And so in the last couple of minutes while we're wrapping up, for someone who would be running for school committee, you know, who's young or really whatever age, what would you say would be maybe 3 to 5 ideas you would give them to try and champion and let them know that this is something that you should think is important?
Yeah, I would say we need to protect public schools, right? That students have enormous potential, and that needs to be supported. I would say that school committee, education is a policy domain that's very complex, and so it's going to take some time. And the public perception of schools, not locally, but nationally and maybe statewide, is inaccurate, that schools are in crisis, that schools are failing. So it's kind of like you've got to go slow to go fast, and you've got to have a passion and a love for what is your community asset. Sometimes schools come across as dry, bureaucratic, or rule following, but they're really a wonderful place, and they need to be protected. They need to be protected as a community asset. They've been around in New Bedford for 200 years. New Bedford has a great history of being the first popular desegregated public schools. Now think about that. School committee members 200 years ago got up and said, private schools aren't working for poor children. Segregated schools in Massachusetts are absurd. So we're going to start a free, popular, desegregated public school system. That's not just for poor kids. That's for all kids, black and white. That's New Bedford. That's New Bedford Public Schools. These were school committee people. Right?
Sure.
So if you're going to be a school committee person, you have to protect that legacy. And we have a wonderful school committee now who get that. And they don't get compensated. They're all volunteer.
Yeah.
So that's so important. You're a board of trustees. Think about that word. You're holding something in trust for future generations. So school committee is a wonderful role, but it's a taxing role. These folks are giving up their time. They're all community contributors in their own way. We have public servants. We have counselors. We have a whole mix of folks. We have parents. And so it's a job I truly respect, school committee, but it is a big job.
Sure. And so how long have you been on the school committee so far?
Well, I'm not on the school committee, but you know.
Oh, being the superintendent and
yeah,
helping with them.
But working with the school committee has been like directly as super has been 2 years. You know, so.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's okay. That's pretty recent.
Yeah, but of course I've been working in the other leadership positions and interacting.
Sure.
Yeah.
And so you intend to, you feel like you still have more work to do? You don't see yourself going anywhere anytime soon?
Unfortunately, I don't know anything else but New Bedford, right?
Sure.
I'm a New Bedford nut. I'm passionate about New Bedford.
Yeah.
My kids are at New Bedford High School. I still think we have challenges. I still think we can demonstrate more success. Our students, we know they can achieve at the highest levels. Are we giving enough supports to have them achieve at that level? I think we could do better. I think I could do a better job every day. And so I'm all in, and I'm just loving every day.
And so, I guess really last question. I'm 26, and so when I look around with our politicians, school committee members, no fault of the people who are in those positions right now, but I'm looking at my peers who are also young, who are not getting politically involved, not really running for office. I feel like really in the 20th century, 60s or 70s, a lot of politics were powered by the youth. Mm-hmm. What would you say is the biggest reason from your perspective for why a lot of young people aren't getting as involved nowadays?
Yeah, I think there's economic pressures, right? It's more difficult. You have less free time, right? You have less free time, I think, than we used to have traditional work structures. We used to have traditional social clubs. There's a great author who I met when I was in university called Robert Putnam. He called it Bowling Alone. So society is getting more atomized. We're on our phones. You can blame whatever you want. That said, I'm not sure that it was all that easy back in history too as well.
Yeah.
I think what you the one thing if you do want to get involved in politics is ignore national politics, ignore the hype, and do small campaigns. Start a rally, start a standout, start an event, and maybe no one will show up the first time. And then 2 years later, the room will be packed. Start a litter campaign, start a traffic safety campaign, and you're going to be learning the whole time. And Tip O'Neill, the great Boston politician, said all politics is local. All politics is local ultimately. And that should be enough. And stay away from, do not believe that politics is cable news. Politics is your school system. And ultimately, it will, but remember, it'll be slow to start. It'll be slow to start, but it will happen in time.
Okay. Andrew, that's been our interview.
Yeah,
Thank you so much for opening up and talking about your life and talking about your position and your career transitioning and how you've grown. And thank you for all the work that you do.
Well, thank you, and thank you for your program. Like we were saying about contributing to your community, this is your contribution to the community, and I know it's going to have an impact, so thank you. My pleasure.
I appreciate it.
Thank you.
And so, everyone, thanks for watching. This has been Andrew O'Leary on Wake Up New Bedford. Catch us in the next episode. Peace.
I'm running.